I am an African.
Everybody, welcome to the Africa for Dummies podcast. Today we're going to be talking about the unfortunate conflict going on in Sudan, and we have a very, very special guest who was gracious enough to join us on the podcast. I'm sure you guys are going to love this one. As always, please be sure to hit that notification bell. Leave us a rating on whichever podcast platform you're listening to this on. And as always, follow us on all social media platforms.
I am an African.
I was quite curious about sort of the region. When you look around the region, not only are they somewhat unstable, but the stable ones are not democratic. Saudi Arabia, Egypt, is rather authoritarian. Ethiopia has had its instabilities in the northern region, the Tigray War. Eritrea, Djibouti are not known for democracy necessarily. Some analysts actually asked the question: is democracy in the region? Is democratic Sudan a threat to the region? Is that why there might be problems in the road to a full, genuine democracy in Sudan?
Yes, absolutely. I think it's not only democracy as such, but because we've had, I should say, in most of Sudan's history, we've been under military dictatorship. But we've had short periods of democratic rule, and yet it's still been elite rule. And so I think what was so inspiring and is so inspiring, I think the revolution really continues. They're the ones who are kind of helping fill a huge vacuum right now that was that was sort of left open by an international aid community that essentially evacuated. And so, the resistance continues, the revolution continues. But what was so powerful about it, is that the grassroots popular elements of it, the unions. I work with farmers' unions in rural parts of the country where there's been incredible civil disobedience and all kinds of organizing against state seizure of lands, and factory workers who have gone on strike during this period, port workers, teachers' unions. There's been a lot of just organizing against elite rule and elite capture, if you will. And the neighborhood resistance committees in particular present an alternative to this kind of opposition parties that are still led by these strong men or charismatic figures that ultimately don't necessarily always represent the will of the people. So they're made up of mostly young people who have a very not only pro-democratic vision for Sudan, but also a sort of popular democratic vision, right? That is anti-capitalist, anti-imperialist, that really is demanding a kind of structural change to the economic and political system that has kept these elites in power since independence. And that's incredibly dangerous to the region, of course. I think in some ways also, there's people have been calling them realistic, they're not sophisticated, they don't have leaders, but that's precisely what makes them powerful, is that they're non-hierarchical and that they are therefore accountable to their people. And this is how they organize, is that everybody, in the neighborhood knows them. And, it's just a very different model for democracy than one we've certainly ever experienced in Sudan. But I would also say probably in most of the world. There are some places, certainly. I think I spent some time in Brazil, for example. There's some very powerful social movements there. But, and there have been popular uprisings on the African continent. You mentioned the Arab Spring earlier, but also since 2004, there have been, over 80 popular uprisings on the African continent, some of which, might have been minor, if you will, but they still represent a wave of kind of sentiment across the continent that we're not satisfied with elite rule and with this kind of continued neo-colonial extractivism that is, that is really impacting us in negative ways. And so I think, yeah, absolutely. There's a domino effect. There's the fact that part of the interest here in Sudan is its strategic location along the Red Sea. So people have been vying for port naval bases and port space, right? Sort of in the way that Djibouti has turned into this kind of, base for various countries.
Every naval base, every country has every superpower or aspiring superpower has a naval base in Djibouti.
Exactly. And there's something kind of similar happening in Sudan. I mean, because of the sanctions regime, the U.S. sanctions regime against Sudan, it's been sort of in isolation on some level since the Clinton administration. But those have been lifted during the transition, at least the majority of them. You don't have it's not quite like Djibouti in the sense that the Gulf are the sort of strongest regional actors there in terms of their investments. Both Al Burhan and Hemeti sent troops, for example, to fight in the war in Yemen on the Saudi coalition's behalf, right? So that's significant here. And so, the Russians have vied for a naval base. The Turks have. And the ones who ultimately won in the recent, latest iteration of this in June of last year, June of 2022, was the Emirates signed a $6 billion deal with a economic elite, a Sudanese elite, to turn an area 200 kilometers north of Port Sudan, which is our national port, into a port, an international airport. They're going to connect that with a private toll road to a huge agribusiness farm that also has external kind of support back, financing. And that's terrible because it means that the UAE, first of all, that the national port will probably get undermined through the building of this new port. And they will then have control over what comes in and out of the country. And, I'm not just talking about militarily here, but also in terms of food. That's what I study. I look at the way that these land grabs, these land, investments have pushed people out of out of farming into other sectors and really into poverty, and how that's made people more dependent on exports for food. And over the last, even the period that I did my fieldwork in the region of Sudan that I'm from, I could see a shift in the rural stores in the sense that, you all of a sudden had more and more products from the UAE and Saudi Arabia, like halal, frozen foods, in part because much of the land that is taken for these Saudi and Emirati, and there's other countries as well, other Gulf states, Turkey, Lebanon, etc. They own, there's a combined probably 5 million acres of the most fertile land in Sudan that is now foreign owned. And that land is primarily being used to grow alfalfa for dairy production. It gets exported to the Gulf and other places. And then those same products end up on our shelves. And so what that means is that in a crisis like this, we went to my father's village, and a decade ago, my aunt said this to me, a decade ago, they would have probably been fine. But because they're so close to Khartoum and people have been dispossessed of their land, in this case by a domestic investor who actually signed this deal with the Emiratis for the port, people are no longer growing food in the same way. They don't have the same kind of self-sufficiency they used to have. And so the food ran, basically.
Yeah, that was actually going to be my next question, which is how self, because when you're talking about the farmers there, you're just simply mentioning, it seems like you're mentioning like one person or something like that. So, I mean, you mentioned that, somebody owns an agribusiness, and it seems like they have significant control over the production, and they're kind of turning Sudan into this backyard almost, where they're producing their inputs for other production. And also just wanted to find out, because from my understanding, Sudan, for example, imports from, I think, the Ukraine, a lot of wheat from the Ukraine and from Russia and things like that. And now you've mentioned on the other side as well, that, within Sudan itself, the self-sufficiency is reducing. So I just wanted to kind of find out if you could just highlight again the impact that, that's going on, the war and then the Ukraine war, and how that's affecting, the agriculture as well. If you could just speak on that, the supply side, mainly on the supply side.
Yeah. So, I mean, certainly, I think the war in Ukraine, the Russian invasion of Ukraine has certainly impacted the Horn of Africa in general, in terms of because of the, as you just mentioned, sourcing our wheat from Ukraine. But I also think it's been a bit overstated in the sense that, to me, the larger issue here is, Sudan, about 60% of the population makes its living in relation to agriculture, the agricultural sector, the rural sector.
And what's the main production? What's the main crop, I should say? Sorry.
I mean, it's shifted in the last decade or so, but it's, it used to be cotton, wheat, sorghum, peanuts, onions. It depends on the region a little bit,
Okay.
Sesame, of course we have, I mean, this is not a crop, but, we're, I think the biggest, largest producer of gum Arabic is, I think it's, it's
Okay.
some things like that.
Yeah.
But again, so yeah, those are, and most of these are cash crops. But usually what would happen with small farmers is you'd have your cash crop, plots, and then you'd have one plot that you usually set aside for for vegetables and
Subsistence.
yeah, subsistence, exactly. And so I'll tell you just on a micro level, my father's village, most of my relatives used to farm. An agribusiness investor who's backed by the Gulf came in and took over the land that they used to farm. Most either moved to the capital to find other kinds of work, or entered this brick-making business along the Nile, And that's really undermined. I mean, they're not eating in the way that they used to. We went from 3 sort of substantial meals a day to like barely 2. And so I think that's, again, I'm talking here about rural people who are, not wealthy, not elite or anything. But still, I think this is the center of the country where there's been stability really for our entire, modern history, and where things are relatively sort of calm and there's, power. This is where the elites draw some of their power from, that base, even if the rural folks themselves are not elite. And so imagine then what that means in a place like Darfur. And this is something people don't really talk about that much, but the millions of people who are displaced from their villages and their farms aren't farming anymore. And what does that mean for their own, for their own nutrition, for their own diets, and the way that diets have had to shift because you're now, relying on, we had a shift basically from sorghum to wheat over this period. Sorghum used to be our main sort of staple. What in other places like ugali or fufu, was this kind of sorghum
Maize, yeah.
pancake, and we've now moved to wheat that is, some of it is grown in Sudan, certainly, and that's also at risk now with what's happening. There's talk of, U.S., right before this fighting happened, the U.S. was trying to, essentially invest in land and grow wheat. And I was worried about that in part because I think what they're trying to do here is to dump U.S. wheat onto
I was gonna say.
subsidized wheat that will then squeeze out
The smaller farmers even further,
like they did in Mexico with corn,
Yeah.
So, these are all dynamics that I think are critical. And I think, yes, sure, the Ukraine did have an impact. But the larger question is, how did we get to a point where Sudan used to be the breadbasket of the Middle East, in the 70s? That's what it was. And there were several failed projects but they were producing a lot, and we're now dependent on imports, So, that's, and that's what then exacerbates a crisis like this, so that even if there's no direct fighting, and there has been in near my dad's village, some of the villages, there has been heavy fighting. One of the markets got burnt down. But even in places where there isn't fighting in Sudan, where it's relatively safe, you're going to be dealing with food shortages. And that, and we saw that certainly in Ethiopia with the Tigray crisis. It wasn't only Tigray that was impacted, right? It was also other regions, in part because of these kinds of dynamics. Yeah.
Oh, okay. And you mentioned that so the land is it's switching from agriculture to other things, like I think the only one you mentioned was the agribusiness that's producing for the cows. Is there anything else that the land is being shifted towards?
That's the main thing. It's not even about necessarily I mean, we're not talking, again, 5 million acres is not that much. But what's happening is that these agribusiness farms outcompete the small farmers. So they put them into, and then they basically sell their land to sort of local elites. So we have a kind of mushrooming of these smaller, medium-sized farms that are more cash crop oriented, that sort of exploit people's labor. So you do have a shift in terms of labor, where people who used to farm on their own farms are now farming for sort of local elites. And that produces its own form of food insecurity. But then also, the other thing I would say, and then also herders, because these big agribusiness farms, I mean, they do take up a large space, and they're fenced off, usually securitized. In fact, in some cases, they hire RSF to secure them. And so what that's done is actually had an even greater impact on some level on herders, because it's cut through grazing routes. They need larger spaces to move through. And so, lots of them are moving into the trucking business and brick making and so forth. We're seeing a big shift in that population that is already very marginalized. So, and then, as I said, my own relatives have moved into brick making, and it's also, it's also women are impacted by this, because most of the agricultural labor is done by women. And so the men have been able to enter brick making and other kinds of, they have more options, but women have sort of wage earners, and I mean, they're making less than $2 a day on these farms. I've farmed with them, I've harvested with them for my research.
Wow. Yeah. Sorry to divert the conversation there. I just do a bit of I'm studying agriculture economics, very 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 junior level. So I just kind of wanted to find out about that. And I guess the next question would be basically, what are the steps? What's, in your opinion, what steps can be taken to bring this conflict to an end, and how can I? Oh, sorry, go ahead.
No, I'm just feeding off of Nathan's question. Can I add, because we normally ask our guests this, so maybe you can fit this into the answer. What if you were, say, in a position of power and influence regarding the kingmakers of this conflict? What would you do? So essentially the question is, what particular steps do you see happening as per the conflict? And in a situation in which you had a critical role insofar as power brokering, what would you do?
Yeah, great question. I mean, the first thing I would do is remove the generals from the table. How to do that, I'm not sure. But, I would not keep propping them up by legitimizing them by putting them at the negotiation table. These are war criminals that need to be tried, And I think, one of the ways of doing that, the hard part about this question is that there has been so much international meddling that it's actually hard, at the moment at least, to imagine a resolution, at least the cessation of fighting, without the international community's involvement, because these generals are more accountable to these international actors than they are to us as people, right? And so we don't really have much leverage with them, unfortunately. And so it's going to be we need a coordinated, coherent international response that pressures them into basically, stopping this fight. We can't do anything until the fighting stops. And so, basically, and I urge also African countries to, get involved here. I mean, there's, we recently saw a vote at the UN where several African countries voted against a kind of effort to monitor human rights abuses in Sudan. And there was a little bit of this sense of like, I don't touch you, you don't touch me kind of situation.
Sovereignty, defense sovereignty, even though like your child is dying, but type of situation.
And I mean, I'm sympathetic to that in the context of like, when the US asked African countries to side with or against Russia, like that's really none of their business. I get that. But when it comes to your own, I mean, these borders are all colonial borders. We are all ultimately connected. I think that needs to be different. And so, to me, I think I'm in the diaspora. I don't think I should be the person prescribing solutions. I think what needs to happen is the borders need to be opened up. The negative international intervention needs to stop. There needs to be pressure on the generals to stop fighting. Countries like Canada, where I am, and the United States need to create the kind of special visa arrangements they have for Ukrainians, for Sudanese people, and make that easy. There needs to be a coordinated humanitarian response at the borders and in Khartoum and Darfur and other places that are hardest hit. And once the fighting stops, the blueprint, any kind of international engagement moving forward, needs to be Sudanese-led. And to me, it needs to be led by the pro-democracy kind of anti-capitalist forces on the ground, which are these unions and resistance committees that have been sidelined in this protracted negotiation process that kind of led to this point. So that's, to me, what needs to happen. They know very well what needs to happen next, and their whole sort of demand was no negotiations, no legitimacy, and no partnership with these war criminals. And so that's the first step. And after that, why not, why is a young person from a neighborhood in Sudan who has been at the forefront of the revolution any less qualified to decide what the future of Sudan is than anybody else, really? I think there's also a lack of imagination here. There's a kind of Eurocentric model of what democracy looks like that is essentially oligarchy, right? Elite rule.
Wow.
And we need to just...
Shout out to America.
Yes, exactly. Essentially a one-party system where, whatever. They are two parties, but they're very similar. So, yeah, we don't want... Why should we model ourselves after that? It hasn't produced any, results in America either. In fact, I'm writing an article on the ways the politics of hunger in the United States are connected to the politics of hunger in Sudan, which is that, there is basically the U.S. is engaging, they're in talks around a farm bill. They've ended food stamps, pandemic-era food stamps for 30 million Americans who are at the brink of essentially hunger, saying the pandemic is over. And at the same time, they're pouring millions of dollars into these bills that are creating partnerships between subsidized U.S. agribusiness and programs like the World Food Program to dump subsidized produce onto Horn of Africa markets. And that's going to make us more hungry, And so I think that's something that we also need to start talking about, how policies that originate in the belly of the beast, if you will, in the United States, are not only harming us, but also harming vulnerable people, marginalized people in the United States, Yeah.
That's a great intended. Do you want to add?
No. It's okay.
Are you sure?
Hey, I can always come back more.
Yeah. It's not.
Now, forever hold your silence.
It's we're already over time. It's fine.
Yeah. No, I wanted to ask a last question regarding. So often we like to give sort of a brighter side to situations. We try to, at least. What perhaps is your biggest inspiration, or what do you think people in all of this negativity need to hear or aren't getting about Sudan and at this point in the crisis and all the media coverage over the crisis and the numerous deaths?
Yeah, no, thank you for that. I think for one, we don't, as Sudanese, have the privilege of losing hope here. I think that's maybe reserved for others, but not for us. And so I think for me, it's the ongoing revolution that gives me incredible hope. We managed to overthrow two dictators and have mounted a very, I'm saying we here, I'm saying here, the people on the ground have mounted an incredible resistance to armed factions that are externally supported. And so that in of itself, I think, should give us tremendous hope. There's a generation of young people that have gotten politicized, that are very aware of the kind of historical dynamics, the kind of racialized violence I talked about earlier, the state-sanctioned violence against the peripheries. They're very aware of all of these things, and I think they're the ones we should put our faith into. I'm not a young person anymore and that's youth anymore, but I have some relatives who are involved in all this organizing, and it's been incredibly inspiring to see that. I think, they've proven once and, time and time again that the only solution here is a full transition to democracy, to democratic rule. And we haven't given them a chance. People say, oh, they're being unrealistic. We have to put these generals at the negotiation table and we have to prop them up in this way and legitimize them so that they will, surrender power, but that strategy has not succeeded. What we need to do now is to really give them the opportunity to let democracy win in this situation, Yeah.
Yeah, no, thank you very much for that. I think that was the last question that we had. Thank you very much, Nisreen, for joining us. We just wanted to also ask if you know of any ways that people can donate or help out people within Sudan. And I don't know if you have any other.
Yeah, no, thank you for that. So I would recommend eyesonsudan.net. It's sort of the diaspora's, it's a website that sort of brings all of that together, where you can donate, where you can educate yourself further, all of those things. I also have, I can send you a list of books that I recommend that people can read. Radio Dabanga and Sudan Tribune are two places where you can get English media updates on Sudan. And I would encourage people to donate to local Sudanese-led humanitarian efforts. Your dollar will go a lot further, and it allows us to build our own capacity rather than to rely on international aid agencies that, as we can see, evacuated and, ceased operation in the middle of a crisis.
Yeah.
So, that's, and eyesonsudan.net will have that information. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. So, thank you so much. That was the episode. Thanks to everyone that joined us on this episode. We hope you gained more insight into what's going on in Sudan. Please make sure to leave us a rating on this podcast wherever you're listening to this. And you can interact with us and follow us on all platforms, Instagram, Twitter. And keep looking out for the next episode. That's it from my side.
I actually have a comment.
Go ahead. Yeah, please.
Sure.
I have I've done a significant number of interviews. I mean, not a ton, but enough to be able to say this. Yours was probably the most informed questions that I've gotten. So I just want to
Really?
Wow.
they were great questions, and you I think just the follow-up questions were great as well. So to your listeners out there, I've been talking to CNN and I mean
CNN, that's big.
BBC, etc. So I have some point of comparison, and so I just want to thank you, and I'd be happy to come back on whenever you want to cover Sudan again, or also recommend other people, certainly on the ground when that's possible. Yeah.
No, that's fantastic. Yeah, thanks. Thanks again. Think if you have any last words.
Yeah, no, I mean, I'm still trying to soak in the compliments. So yeah, no, I mean, it's been absolutely informative and sort of enlightening to hear a Sudanese person tell us about the Sudanese perspective, because often we tend to look at things from Eurocentric. Even Africans receive Eurocentric information about fellow African countries, and I think it's important to get it directly from someone that's there with an expert opinion combined. And of course, we're gonna definitely reach out to, and this is always an evolving issue on Sudan's sort of shaky road to democracy. And I don't know if Nathan, you have anything else to say, or we can close it up there?
Yeah, I think we can close it up. So thanks for listening.
I am an African.